Well, hello, I'm Dr. Mary Malway, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about reflexes and development. So, a little bit about me. I was an educator for 30 years. My last assignment was working as an assistant head of school at a school for kids with dyslexia. So, I was a reading specialist for about 20 years in my career. And when I retired from K-12 education in June, I launched my private practice called BrainWorks. And I specialize in primitive and primary reflex integration, primarily using MNRI, musculoskeletal neurosensory and reflex integration. So today I just wanted to take a little bit of time to talk to you about what reflexes are and how those might be impacting your child's development. This is a famous quote from Aristotle that movement is life. And it is in fact what keeps us alive, what develops our brain, what develops our sensory systems, what keeps our memory from dying is movement. And so today we're going to talk about movement patterns in the first 3 years of life, starting in utero and moving up to about 3 years, but all the way through our lifespan. Movement is what keeps us alive and healthy and keeps our neurons firing correctly. So by the end of our webinar today, you should understand what a reflex is, how reflex patterns impact a child's social, emotional, physical, and cognitive development, what causes retained reflexes, and what happens after integration of those reflexes. So this pyramid is a really wonderful representation of all the things that need to happen for us to get to this very top level. You can see at the top of the pyramid, it says executive functioning and academic performance. Now, usually when people come to my office, it's because they have concerns about those top two levels. They're not reading well. They're not focused. They're easily distracted in class. They don't seem to remember what's going on or what the teacher said. Those are all the top two tiers. But look at all the things that have to happen in order for us to reach those tiers. Now, reflexes, what we're going to talk about today, are the very, very bottom of this pyramid. Our nervous system has to be developed, connected, and matured in order for us to move up the pyramid to get to those highest level skills. Neuroreflexes begin in utero shortly after conception and go through a developmental pattern through those first 3 years. You can see that the reflexes have to have emerged and integrated for our sensory systems to come online, then for our motor systems to come online, for sensory processing and perceptual motor, and then communication skills, life management, socialization, attention and focus, and finally academic learning and executive functioning. So we're focusing our efforts here at the bottom of this pyramid. So what are reflexes? There's a lot of information out there on the internet, and some of it's accurate and some of it isn't. So let's see what we can learn about it today in our short presentation. So primary reflex patterns are the ones that develop at the beginning, the primary ones. And these are some pictures of some of the primary reflex patterns. We have spinal galant up here in the left corner. We have Babinski. We have the ATNR, or asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, in the upper right-hand corner. And then the Moro reflex is in the bottom corner. So let's take a little deep dive into some of these patterns. So primary reflex patterns are innate sensory motor patterns, meaning that they're in our DNA. They're not something that have to be taught. They are supposed to emerge on their own and not need anything special for that to happen. They begin developing during pregnancy in utero and continue through the first 3 years of life, as I mentioned, and they are genetically encoded. So each reflex pattern helps develop the nerve net system, myelination of sensory and motor axons, and overall brain maturation. Myelination means that once a pathway is connected, say our auditory processing pathway, once that has been connected through these reflex patterns, that pathway is very thin. It doesn't have a lot of roadway, so to speak. And so myelination is actually adding essential fatty acids to that pathway so that there's more width to it. It would be like the difference between going to a 2-lane road as opposed to a 6-lane highway. So the more those pathways are myelinated or matured, then the easier that information can flow down them. Primary reflex patterns also serve as the foundation of neurodevelopment and neuroplasticity, and they determined how we interact with the world. So I just love this slide. This is a picture of how our synapses change just in the first few years of life. So synapses are connections between neurons in the brain. And here's right at newborn. This is how dense the synapses are, 1 month. Look at the difference there between 1 month and 9 months. And then 2 years. Isn't that remarkable? In the first 2 years of life, our brains grow and change so rapidly. And you'll notice that the difference between 2 years and adult really isn't that dramatic, right? So the majority of our brain development actually happens in those first 2 years of life. So the emergence and the maturation and the integration of these reflex patterns is vital in order for that to happen. Now, primary reflex patterns emerge in a predictable pattern. Normal development occurs within a standard window, and infants are born with very few synapses in place, as you saw from the slide that I just showed you. Reflexes create synapses, create pathways, and make connections, and then further movement and experiences myelinate those pathways. So the reflexes will develop a pattern, say the first time a baby rolls over, right? That's a new pathway, that's a new skill. It's very exciting when that happens. But then that pathway will mature as the baby rolls and rolls and rolls, or when they first start crawling or start walking. At first, walking is very unstable and it's very cautious, but as they do it more and more, it becomes automatic as those pathways are matured and myelinated. Now, this particular chart comes off the Moscotova website. It is cited here at the bottom. I really liked it because it kind of gives you an idea of when certain reflexes should emerge and when they should integrate. So this is just a list of some of the reflexes down the left-hand side, when they emerge, and then when they integrate is in the right-hand column. So if we look at the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, this is a big one in reading. It emerges in utero at 3 months gestation, and then will integrate at 6 to 7 months after birth. The spinal galant reflex, again, emerges in utero at 3 to 4 months and will integrate 5 to 9 months after birth. And then looking at the bottom, spinal parese, this is the one that babies use to push their bellies and their heads up off the ground when they're having tummy time. That emerges at birth and that integrates 2 to 3 years after birth. Now, when a reflex integrates, that doesn't mean that it disappears completely. It always becomes part of our toolbox that we could use if our bodies needed it for some particular reason. So it's always there as kind of our, like it's running in the background if we needed it, but that's not the primary pattern that we're going to use once we've passed that stage of development, if that makes sense to you. So let's take a look at a few of these primary reflex patterns. So this is the ATNR, the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. Looks like the fencer pose. And this drawing of this baby has a really great ATNR position. Sometimes you'll see that knee bent a little bit more when they're in full position, but one arm extends and the head turns towards that arm. That emerges at 3 to 4 months gestation during pregnancy, integrates 6 to 7 months after birth. It helps with nursing. As mom is holding baby against her, the head will turn to one side. Has a lot to do with muscle tone. I want you to think about the baby turning its head. Maybe you can do that where you're sitting right now. Turn your head and put your arm out and feel all the muscles in your back and your abdominals that flex and extend to make that happen. And your neck flexors, you see all that happens? So it's really important for muscle tone on both sides. Bilaterality is being able to use both sides of the body. And so if a child only has this on one side, as I saw with an infant a couple months ago, they can only go into ATNR this side, but not this side. Now, if that wasn't integrated for that child, then they would not have bilaterality when they were older. They would be dominant on one side. And so I was able to get that reflex to emerge for this infant at a traumatic birth. And for some reason, this reflex didn't integrate or emerge on that side. So we were able to intervene and get that turned on for them. It's really important for hand-eye coordination. If you think about a baby laying on the floor and they turn their head to one side and put their arm out, they are looking out towards their hand, and they will use this reflex to start grabbing for things at one side, reaching for things on the other side. And it's really important for development of the auditory processing system. So consider when the baby's head is turned, this ear is up and this ear is processing what's going on in the world. When we turn this way, we're processing from this ear, and our ears actually hear and process slightly different things because they're processed in opposite sides of the brain. And so we need to make sure that both sides of that system are developed and able to process information so our brain can fuse them together and get all of the information. So if the ATNR is retained, it can impact visual skills like visual tracking and convergence because that requires us to cross midline, muscle tone, gait or the way that we walk, hand-eye coordination, reading, penmanship, physical coordination, auditory processing, and difficulty crossing the midline. That's very important because all brain messages have to go across midline, across the corpus callosum. So we see in the right eye, but it's processed in the left side of the visual cortex. We hear in the left ear, but it's processed in the right temporal lobe. So everything is contralateral. So crossing midline neurologically is vital for learning, motor development, and sensory processing. So trunk extension is the next one. I don't have a great picture of this one, but if you hold the baby up, their legs will straighten and their toes will point down. That's trunk extension. And even like 13 weeks in utero, these little peanut of an infant in gestation is already extending their little trunk. It is just adorable. So this emerges 1 month after birth and integrates 7 to 8 months after birth. It provides a connection between the brainstem and the neocortex. It provides grounding. It activates the cerebral spinal fluid pump and is the basis of postural control. So let's talk a moment about cerebral spinal fluid pump. So our brain is washed in cerebral spinal fluid every day, all day. But there's no pump that does it for us all day by itself. It's actually activated through walking or running, that sacral spinal pump right at the base of our spine there, at our pelvis, pushes that cerebral spinal fluid up around the brain. And then we take a deep breath. The ventricles expand in our brain and it washes the fluid around and back down the spinal cord. And that is how we get that around. So trunk extension activates that cerebral spinal fluid pump and gets that motion going. And even a 1% dehydration of CSP or cerebral spinal fluid can cause things like brain fatigue and kind of cloudy thinking, things like that, reduced memory, because basically our brains dehydrate. And then postural control. So if you sitting where you are, if you just kind of take your hands up against your sides here and kind of push down towards the floor, you'll feel your whole trunk extend. And this is so important for activating those spinal muscles and our core, which allows for postural control. And notice when you push down that your shoulders come back into this lovely posture. Trunk extension does a lot for the brain. Really involved for kids who toe walk or hand flap for stimming when they're overexcited. So if it's retained, it can impact postural control, learning to walk, development of the neocortex, self-regulation, which is all up here, and as I mentioned, stimming and toe walking. So this reflex is called Babkin Palmomental, and in an infant, if you squeeze into the center of their hand, their mouth will open and the tongue will move. You see this a lot in kids if it's retained when they write. Their tongue will go out the side of their mouth because they're squeezing their hand around the pencil. So it emerges in utero and integrates 4 months after birth. It's involved in sucking and swallowing. It influences facial expression, movement of the skull bones. So you have bones in your skull that actually move. This is what craniosacral therapy focuses on. And exploration of both sides of the body. So if we push on this side, the baby's going to turn towards that side. It's about seeking nurturance is really what this reflex is about. So if you want baby to nurse, you can push their hand and they will turn towards mom for that nourishment. Now, if it's retained beyond the time that it's supposed to integrate, it can result in thumb sucking or chewing on clothing, poor speech articulation or speech delay, poor handwriting, low muscle tone in the hands, so you see difficulties with writing, eating disorders and excessive nail biting, and a lot of tension in the jaw. This is the Babinski reflex. In a baby, if you stroke the side of their foot, their toes will flail like this. The big toe will go down, and the other toes will go up, or vice versa. It emerges 1 week after birth, and it integrates 1 to 2 years after birth. It supports crawling and preparing to walk. So when a baby is on the ground and they're starting to crawl, they'll actually push off with their toes, and that helps integrate the Babinski. A retained Babinski can result in poor balance and coordination. If you think about that input on the foot that makes their toes flail, every time they walk, if this is still active, they're getting that input. So you may see kids who toe walk to stay off of that Babinski or they may not get their heel all the way down because they don't want that odd input, or they might bounce when they walk, right? So every time they're hitting the ground, they're getting that input and it causes this little bounce. They may have a poor sense of being grounded in their own body, have a poor gait. They may have difficulty with speech articulation, social withdrawal, and again, toe walking. So if these reflexes stay active, and we only covered a few of them, I just wanted to give you some examples of what they were and how they can impact kids. What do we do about that if they're still active, and how do we know what order to integrate them in? Well, in MNRI and other methodologies, movement patterns similar to infant movements are used. Remember that I said that these are genetically encoded. So if reflexes didn't emerge correctly, or if they didn't integrate correctly, we can use similar movements. MNRI is the most specific and most scientific approach to this. And those similar movements will activate that genetic code, and then the pattern will emerge or integrate the way that it's supposed to. So in the case of that infant that I worked with, the ATNR had not emerged. So I was able to help it emerge using a similar movement pattern. And for a child that hasn't integrated, again, I can use a similar movement pattern because the brain will recognize, oh, I'm not supposed to have that pattern anymore. My DNA says I should be on a higher stage. And then it can integrate that way. So isotonic or isometric approaches can be added. That is something that you'd learn in an MNRI class. And when you assess these kinds of things, you're looking for accuracy of the movement, timing, and latency. Like how long can they do it? How long is it between movements? Those kinds of things. What about dysfunction or pathology of reflex patterns? So there are times when reflexes don't emerge the way they were supposed to, or they develop pathologically or incorrectly. So there might be part of a pattern, but not the whole thing. So there are things that occur that can make that happen, such as genetic issues like trisomy 21, that's the underlying cause of Down syndrome, maternal health issues like diabetes or hypothyroidism during pregnancy, infectious disease, medication. Some medications can cause this to happen to the developing baby, birth trauma such as emergency C-sections, hypoxia, and premature birth, particularly ultra-preemies, are more at risk. Chronic stress during pregnancy, and illness, accident, and injury. So all of these things can impact the way that reflexes emerge, develop, and integrate over time. And I will say that 100% of the kids that I see in my office have had some issue in the birth process. Either they were high risk, mom was on bed rest, or there was a cord wrapped around the neck, which is hypoxia, or they were emergency C-section, or they were stuck in the canal, they were in NICU. It is 100% of the kids who find their way to my office have something like this in their history. Also related to this are stress and trauma. So I mentioned chronic stress, but another area of interest for me is polyvagal theory, which was developed by Stephen Porges. And this is the prevailing theory in mental health care today when we're talking about people surviving trauma and prolonged stress. So we have two branches of the vagus nerve, ventral and dorsal vagal, and it regulates our autonomic nervous system. So ventral vagal is parasympathetic. That's our rest and digest. That's where we want to be. We can have healthy relationships. We interact in the world. We're at peace. We can have a calm mind. We can learn new things. We can engage with other people. But when there's stress, we only have a couple of options for handling that. One is fight or flight, and it doesn't have to be a full-on fight or flight response. When you start to get upset and your heart rate starts to increase and your palms start to get a little sweaty, that's a fight or flight response. And so your brain is constantly making decisions about, can I overcome this stress? Is this something that I can get through if I just recruit this physiological response? Can I buckle down and get through it? Like at work, if you have a big deadline or a lot of things coming up that need to get handled right away, and it's a little stressful, you may have difficulty sleeping for a few nights, or you may feel a bit on edge. That's that physiological response of fight or flight. But most of the time, we can get through that, and then fight or flight will calm down, and we get to go back into ventral vagal and to rest and digest. Sometimes, though, if we're stuck in that for a long period of time, we're living in a situation that's highly stressful for a long period of time. We're working in a hostile work environment, or we are serving in combat and our lives are in danger every moment of the day. We're in fight or flight for so long that it gets stuck on is the easiest way to think of that. And then the brain has to make a decision. Is this circumstance something that I can get through, or is it something that I can't survive unless I go into protection mode? And if that's the case, we go into fear paralysis. And in fear paralysis, it's also called deer in the headlight, we freeze. Our vision freezes, so we have a very difficult time tracking or converging. We're just frozen. We lose our voice, meaning that we're taking much shallower breaths because we don't want to be heard. And so taking a deep breath is hard. We may lose our voice metaphorically. We won't speak up. We may whisper a lot. So children who don't speak at full volume may be dealing with fear paralysis. And this protective mode, fear paralysis, has another host of neurobiological things that go along with that. But this is when a situation is so overwhelming, like some kind of assault or traumatic event, where the brain just says, nope, I cannot handle this. And the only thing for me to do is to go into protection. So we go way over here into dorsal vagal, into fear paralysis. And a lot of children that I work with, the birth trauma was significant enough that they were born in fear paralysis. And if babies were born before 33 weeks, the ventral vagal circuit isn't developed yet. So the only circuit they have is dorsal vagal. So they are already born into a stress response because that's all their nervous system has. And when that happens, then the rest of the reflex patterns most likely will not emerge or develop correctly because our brain is stuck in survival, and the brain only cares about survival. So if that gets activated, development doesn't matter at that point. What matters is survival. So what kind of modalities are out there for integrating reflexes? Well, the three dominant ones in the US today are MNRI, which, as I mentioned, is Moscotova's work, RMTI, rhythmic movement training. There's two divisions of that. And then Melillo's work. Dr. Melillo wrote Disconnected Kids and created the brain balance system, brain balance centers. Now, I am trained in RMTI, and I'm also an instructor for Brain Gym, but MNRI is what I've been studying in the last 15 years, and it is by far the most scientific, and the results that I see out of MNRI are spectacular, life-changing results. I'm not exaggerating that. In full disclosure, I'm a core in training there, and I do serve on the board of the graduate school. But the work has been so phenomenal, so life-changing for my clients that this is the primary modality that I use and continue to train in because of Dr. Moscatova's deep knowledge of the nervous system and how it develops and all of the the features to it at a level that well, I've done hundreds of hours of training, and I've only scratched the surface, honestly. The other methods people have success in, so I'm not speaking badly of those. I personally saw great healing from RMTI for my own physical issues, but for the purpose of reflex integration, I believe that MNRI is the best way to go. So in my practice, I also offer other adjunct programs. So once we've integrated reflexes and we've worked on, neurotactile system and archetype movements, those are all different classes in the MNRI program. Sometimes we need to myelinate those pathways. And so I do offer other adjunct programs. So Focus program uses music and movement with bone conduction to speed up myelination of certain pathways. And there's different programs in there: auditory processing, coordination, attention. Those are all different programs in the Focus program. And that is published by ILS, who also publishes Safe and Sound Protocol. Now, SSP was developed by Stephen Porges, the one who developed polyvagal theory. And it is a listening program which uses the auditory system as a way into the vagus nerve to calm it. So sound sensitivity, anxiety, withdrawal, these are all things that SSP can really help with. And sometimes I will use this in the early stages of working with someone if the sound sensitivity is impacting their quality of life. So for example, I had a TBI 4 years ago, and the sound sensitivity was so bad, I would break into tears in public spaces. And when somebody would speak to me, I would start to have a panic attack because I couldn't process the sound. So I did SSP. So it depends on why somebody comes to me, as to which program I will use in conjunction with reflex integration. Interactive metronome has been around for a long time. It trains midbrain, so thalamus, basal ganglia, improves timing of sensory auditory information with motor planning. Really great for autism, TBI, concussion, dyslexia. I use it a lot with my clients with dyslexia. And so people are clapping and tapping in rhythm to a metronome, and it measures that, and you can improve that over time. And then the last additional program I use is called Play Attention. It's a game-based form of neurofeedback to improve executive functioning, training, sustained attention, and divided attention and inhibition. So looking at those features of executive functioning and using a game and brain waves to improve functioning in that prefrontal cortex, because that's the last part of the brain to develop. So oftentimes kids that I work with will need additional training to improve that myelination in that part of the brain. So here is my contact information. You are welcome to reach out to me if you have further questions. You can follow me on YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn. If you go to my website, you can sign up for my bi-weekly email, and I send out a variety of articles through there every 2 weeks. So thank you for listening to the presentation, and I would love to hear from you if you have further questions. Thank you.